and Adam Connor.
Well, it's great to be here. This is a tremendously exciting time for the young progressive movement, and it's almost funny for me to be here right now. Over the last 4 or 5 years, I've literally watched this young progressive movement really just sprout up around me, and I happen to be, for a large part of it, in the right place at the right time. And thanks to some of the amazing people who are out here, I think I'm really a success story that came out of it, and I'm happy to stand up here and brag for some of the groups that brought me this far. But I came to this, and I don't know if you heard my introduction from Mike, with my toe in many different waters, from a lot of different worlds. I'd worked presidential campaigns, I'd been a blogger, I've been involved with some of the youth organizations here, Young People for the Roosevelt Institution. I'd done some stuff with the College Democrats, and now I work on the Hill. So many different worlds. And last year, this conference was tremendously lonely for someone who's really young. There weren't many of us here. That I can probably count on one hand the amount of young people that were really here. And this year, the faces out in the crowd and the people here and the organizations that are here are. A lot of my friends are here, and it's great to see these silos breaking down and understanding that the progressive movement, the Netroots movement, what people will call the open left movement, these things are all starting to realize that they're interdependent on each other and can succeed using each other, and I think that's going to be a tremendous step forward for us. I think for me, as I said, this has been a very personal journey for me in terms of my experiences, and there's certain events I think that are important to look at in the formation of this young progressive movement. And obviously the most important of that was the day after Election Day in 2004. And I know several groups, the Roosevelt Institution and others, that was a real formidable time, not just because Bush had won and progressives were demoralized, but because the tremendous amount of energy that had gone into to trying to get John Kerry elected without any thought about what happened the next day, whether he won or lost, to be frank. And all of a sudden there was just this giant void. And there were all these people, and there were lists of names and people who had been energized, and they just didn't really know what to do with them. And so in this vacuum and in this need for something to fill that, you saw groups start to emerge. And I think one of the first times, and one of the things that you learn as a progressive organizer on a college campus, as an organization, is it's a tremendously lonely experiences, and a lot of times. You don't have much money, you don't know really what's out there, and before there wasn't much out there. And in 2005, Campus Progress from Center for the American Progress had their first Campus Progress conference. And for a lot of us, it was the first time we were able to look around the room and see there were people from across the country who were interested in the same things we were doing. And even though that we had known they were out there kind of in a broad circumstance, it was really nice to sit down in a room and see these people there. And I think for a lot of us, even though it was just a day, it was that touchstone that really helped us understand that there was a movement growing. And I actually just finished writing a piece for the Journal of Netroots Ideas, which is being published by Yearly Coast. I believe it's called Netroots. I actually don't know the web address. But it's being published about the young progressive movement as I saw it go around me in the different organizations that you see here and in the room, and the different structures that emerged, which I think is probably one of the more interesting things to look at. As you saw the young progressive movement, it's very broad now, and people are taking different approaches to that, and that's tremendously important. You have some organizations that are focusing on providing resources because they have them, groups like Campus Progress. There's some that are focused on developing leaders, be they on college campuses like Young People for, be they mid-level professionals like Center for Progressive Leadership, be they in partisan field like I know the Young Democrats have been doing, be they on non-traditional field the way that Forward Montana has been in the bus project out in Oregon. And then you saw other groups like the Roosevelt Institution, which I was fortunate enough to have been involved in relatively early and helped start their DC chapter. And the Roosevelt Institution is it's a student think tank, and it's all these kids from across the country who woke up on November 6th and decided that they wanted to say in public policy because they were tired of being asked for their votes and their bodies to do canvassing, but never for their ideas. And it's grown into a tremendously successful network of students across the country. And by that same token, the Young People For program, which had invested in me fairly early, now is incredibly successful and has expanded its boundaries just beyond college students. But I think what's tremendously interesting to look at is how all these organizations now survive in this nexus together, and how reinforced, and how they're opening the doors and cross-pollinating. And one of the things we hear a lot, not just in the young progressive movement, but in the progressive movement as a whole, is this famous memo called the Powell Memo. And it was written in the 1970s by Powell, who would go on to be a Supreme Court justice nominated by Nixon. And it kind of laid out the entire conservative infrastructure that we see today. So think tanks, politicians and pipelines, leadership institute, different things like that. And it was this whole blueprint that really, in the last few years, has become almost legendary status among the progressive movement. This is why we're getting losing all the time, because of this incredible infrastructure that they've been pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into each year. So when I sat down to write this piece about the young progressive movement, I at first was envisioning some sort of Powell-like memo. Here's what we need to do. Here's the 10. And I looked around, and as I did research and talked to my friends in these organizations, I found out that these things were all happening, but on a very different level than they were in the Republican Party and in the conservative movement, which was actually better. They were taking the passions that they already had, and they were putting pragmatism into it too, but also in a way that was sustainable. And it wasn't copying the right, but it was doing it in a way that could, at some level, someday soon, kind of compete with the right and without being the right. And I think that's a tremendously important development. And if you read the piece online, I think you can get a better sense of that. Now, one of the things, obviously, being at Yearly Coast that's interesting is how this all fits in with the internet. And all of these organizations will tell you, they do a lot of their work via the internet, whether it's emails or the websites. I know Young People 4 has a blog, Forward Montana has a great site, But what you've seen is, I think, less voices for a generation on the blog. So there's no key young blog. I know FutureMajority tracks young young progressive movement stuff, but there's no real cultural nexus for young people on the blogs. And I think part of that's because in the blogosphere there are young bloggers like myself, but they learn to write very early with an adult voice. And to be taken seriously by adults. And as you've seen these people, Ezra Klein, for instance, Matthew Iglesias, different other ones, they write with a very adult voice. And while it's tremendously exciting to be taken seriously by the kind of serious world, I think you get this void that ends up where the young, talented bloggers end up being taken very seriously and writing at this higher level. And there's kind of a middle space that really still needs to be filled by young voices on young issues. And I think that's a tremendous, probably the challenge I see the most. These organizations are succeeding and doing great funding-wise and different things like that, but that space for the internet is probably the one I think I'm most interested to see filled. Obviously, young people get their information in different ways than older ones. There's a lot of social networking emphasis these days, Facebook, MySpace, that sort of thing, but there is a center of communication and I think cultural connectors, as Matt called them, that hasn't really found its place on the internet yet, that I know is out there, and I'm looking forward to someday to having that, because it would be a lot of fun to read. And then finally, I think a lot of this gets focused on organizational structures, which has the best plan, what's doing what. But one of the things the right has tremendously succeeded in, and this isn't in the Powell memo, is the informal social networks they end up having. And these informal social networks end up being the things that carry them into the White House and getting the 10 college Republicans from 1976 into cabinet positions or whatnot. And so by developing these organizations early, these informal social networks are tremendous things. Whether they're candidates who end up running for office at some point and having a donor base, whether it's ideas that get cross-pollinated, whether it's passions that get shared, I think the informal social networks are something that you almost can't put a price on. Because in 10 or 20 years, maybe you're electing someone to the office to the U.S. Senate, and you're electing their kind of entire sphere of influence. And if that sphere of influence has come from the young progressive movement with them, you're going to get a much more dynamic engine out of that. So, in conclusion, I wouldn't be here without the young progressive movement. I started off with the Roosevelt Institution. Young People 4 brought me in. It's where I met Jerome Armstrong from IDD and ended up working on the Warner campaign and then becoming a blogger from IDD. So I think all of these things in context are doors that open for me, and I hope that more doors can be opened for more people so that next year when we're sitting on a panel like this, I'll recognize some faces, but more importantly, I won't recognize a lot of them, because that means we're bringing new people into the movement.
Thanks, Adam.